The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of room 203 at Westbrook High School, casting long shadows across the freshly waxed floors. It was just another Monday in February, or so Miss Peterson thought as she arranged the papers on her desk with military precision. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in its usual tight bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses sat perfectly straight on her nose. After 23 years of teaching English, she had her morning routine down to the minute. The first bell hadn't rung yet, but most of her students were already settling into their seats. That's how things worked in Miss Peterson's advanced placement English class. You were either early or you were in trouble. She took pride in running the most disciplined classroom in the entire school, something that had earned her both respect and fear from students and fellow teachers alike. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge that told students to sit up straight and pay attention. "Before we begin our discussion of The Great Gatsby, I have an announcement." The class collectively held its breath. In Ms. Peterson's world, announcements usually meant pop quizzes or extra assignments. But this time, it was different. "We have a new student joining us today," she continued, her eyes fixed on the door. Right on cue, the main office secretary appeared, leading a boy who looked like he was trying his best to disappear into thin air. The new student stood awkwardly at the front of the class, wearing a faded blue sweater that had seen better days and carrying a worn backpack held together by safety pins. His dark hair fell slightly over his eyes, which remained fixed on the floor as if the scuffed tiles held the secrets of the universe. "This is Alex Chen," Ms. Peterson announced, pronouncing each syllable as if she were teaching a phonics class. "He's transferred from—" She glanced down at the paperwork on her desk, her eyebrows lifting slightly, "Pine Ridge Public School." A quiet murmur rippled through the classroom. Pine Ridge was from the other side of the tracks, quite literally. It was the kind of school that made the local news for all the wrong reasons. Ms. Peterson's lips tightened into a thin line as she studied Alex more closely. His clothes might be worn, but they were clean. His hair might be untidy, but it was freshly washed. Still, something about him set off warning bells in her mind. "You may take the empty seat by the window," she said, pointing to the only available desk in the room. As Alex made his way between the rows, she added, "I assume you've read The Great Gatsby." Alex nodded quietly, still not making eye contact. "Verbal responses in this classroom, Mr. Chen," Ms. Peterson said sharply. "We're not conducting a game of charades." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew that tone. It was the same one she used right before someone ended up in detention. "Yes, ma'am," Alex replied softly but clearly. "I've read it twice." Miss Peterson's eyebrows rose even higher. "Twice? How ambitious." The way she said it made it sound more like a character flaw than a virtue. "Then you won't have any trouble participating in today's discussion about the symbolism of the green light." It wasn't a question, and everyone in the room knew it. This was Ms. Peterson's way of testing new students, throwing them into the deep end to see if they would sink or swim. She'd been doing it for years, convinced it was the best way to maintain the high standards she was known for. As Alex settled into his seat, Ms. Peterson noticed other details that bothered her. His notebook was a simple spiral-bound affair, not the leather-bound journals most of her students carried. His pen was a basic ballpoint, not the expensive fountain pens she was used to seeing. Everything about him seemed ordinary, and ordinary had no place in her advanced placement class. The next 45 minutes became an exercise in subtle intimidation. Every time another student made a point about the novel, Ms. Peterson would turn to Alex and ask, "And what do you think about that, Mr. Chen?" Each time, he would provide a thoughtful, if quietly spoken, response, and each time, she would find some small fault with his analysis. "Interesting perspective," she would say, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Though perhaps a bit simplistic. The other students watched this back and forth with growing discomfort. They were used to Ms. Peterson's strict standards, but this felt different. This felt personal. Raj, one of the top students in the class, attempted to defend Alex's interpretation of Gatsby's character, but Ms. Peterson shut him down with a sharp look. "While I appreciate your collaborative spirit, Mr. Patel, I believe Mr. Chen needs to learn to stand on his own 2 feet in this class." As the lesson progressed, Alex maintained his composure, though his shoulders seemed to sink lower with each passing minute. He took careful notes, his pen moving steadily across the page, even as Ms. Peterson's critiques became more pointed. When the bell finally rang, there was an almost audible sigh of relief from the class. As students began packing up their things, Ms. Peterson called out, "Mr. Chen, a moment please." Alex approached her desk, his worn backpack clutched like a shield against his chest. "I'll be direct," Ms. Peterson said, adjusting her glasses. "This is an advanced placement class. We maintain certain standards here. Standards that, frankly, I'm not sure you're prepared to meet." "I understand, ma'am," Alex replied, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "I'll work hard to meet those standards." "See that you do," she responded crisply, "because I won't hesitate to recommend your transfer to a more appropriate level if necessary." As Alex left the classroom, Miss Peterson began organizing her papers for the next class, already convinced she knew exactly what kind of student he would turn out to be. She had seen his type before, or at least she thought she had. Students from the wrong side of town who somehow slipped through the cracks in the system and ended up in her advanced classes. They never lasted long. What she didn't notice was how Alex walked with his head held high despite her warnings, or how several of his new classmates offered him sympathetic smiles in the hallway. She didn't see him carefully place his old notebook in his patched backpack, handling it with the care one might reserve for something precious. And she certainly didn't notice the quiet determination in his eyes as he headed to his next class. But then again, Miss Peterson had stopped noticing a lot of things over her 23 years of teaching. She had become so focused on maintaining her standards that she'd forgotten what it meant to really see her students. She didn't know it yet, but Alex Chen was about to remind her, in a way that would shake the very foundations of everything she thought she knew about teaching, about students, and about herself. 2 weeks had passed since Alex's arrival in Ms. Peterson's AP English class, and the tension in room 203 could be cut with a knife. Despite his perfect attendance and completed homework assignments, Ms. Peterson's scrutiny of the quiet transfer student had only intensified. Today was meant to be special, presentation day for their major project on modern interpretations of classic literature. The classroom hummed with nervous energy as students shuffled their note cards and rehearsed under their breath. Even the usually confident kids looked anxious. Ms. Peterson's presentations were infamous for her interruptions and cutting remarks if anything wasn't up to her exacting standards. "Let's begin," Ms. Peterson announced, consulting her gradebook. "Mr. Chen, since you're our newest addition, why don't you go first?" The class collectively winced. Everyone knew this was classic Peterson strategy, putting the new kid on the spot, hoping they'd crack under pressure. Alex slowly stood up from his desk, clutching a carefully prepared folder of notes. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd spent considerable time preparing for this moment. "My presentation," he began softly, "is about connecting the Great Gatsby to modern wealth inequality and the American dream." "Speak up," Ms. Peterson interrupted sharply. "This isn't a library whisper session." Alex cleared his throat and started again, his voice stronger but slightly shaky. "In both Gatsby's time and today, we see how wealth—" "Stand straight," Ms. Peterson cut in again. "And look at your audience, not your shoes." A few students exchanged knowing looks. They'd all been through this before, but watching it happen to someone else was painful. Reg, sitting near the front, gave Alex an encouraging nod. Alex adjusted his posture and continued, making a visible effort to project his voice. As he delved into his analysis, comparing the green light in Gatsby to modern status symbols, his passion for the subject began to shine through. His voice grew more confident as he connected themes from the novel to real-world examples. But just as he was hitting his stride, Miss Peterson struck again. "Mr. Chen, are you suggesting that Fitzgerald's masterpiece is merely a critique of materialism? How superficial." Alex's rhythm faltered. "No, I'm trying to show how the themes of hope and—" "Complete sentences, Mr. Chen. This is an advanced placement presentation, not a casual conversation at the mall." The interruption threw him off completely. His next few points came out jumbled as he tried to remember his carefully prepared arguments while processing Ms. Peterson's criticism. His hands began to tremble slightly as he shuffled through his notes. He stumbled over his words, the confidence from moments ago evaporating under Miss Peterson's relentless stare. Perhaps, Miss Peterson said, standing up from her desk, you should have spent more time preparing and less time. She paused, eyeing his worn clothes, doing whatever it is you do after school. The room fell silent. Even the usual hallway noise seemed to dim. This was beyond her usual strictness. This was different, more personal. I did prepare, Alex said quietly, but firmly. I spent all weekend. All weekend. Ms. Peterson's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Then surely you can explain why your analysis completely overlooks the crucial role of social class mobility in Chapter 3, or why you've apparently forgotten to address Nick's unreliable narrator status. These are basic elements, Mr. Chen. Basic elements that anyone who claims to have read the book twice should understand. Alex's face flushed red. His hands gripped the edges of his folder so tightly the papers began to crease. I understand those elements, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just structured my presentation to focus on a surface-level reading that wouldn't pass muster in a freshman English class, let alone an AP course. Miss Peterson walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the tile floor like a judge's gavel. I think we've all seen enough. Please take your seat, Mr. Chen. But Alex didn't move. May I at least finish? I have 3 more points, To. I said take your seat. Miss Peterson's voice could have frozen water. And since you clearly need more practice with analytical thinking, you'll write me a 10-page paper on the proper way to analyze literary themes. Due tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? Alex's voice cracked slightly. But I have work after. That sounds like a personal problem, Mr. Chen. Perhaps this will teach you to prioritize your academic responsibilities. She turned to write the assignment on the board, speaking over her shoulder. The paper will analyze all major themes in The Great Gatsby, with particular attention to social mobility and narrator reliability. The elements you so conspicuously ignored today include a minimum of 8 scholarly sources, NLA format, naturally. Alex slowly gathered his presentation materials, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to prevent his papers from spilling onto the floor. As he made his way back to his desk, Miss Peterson added, and Mr. Chen, I expect original work. If I detect any plagiarism, and believe me, I will check thoroughly, you'll be facing more than just a failing grade. The rest of the class period passed in uncomfortable silence. Even the usually eager participants kept their heads down, avoiding Ms. Peterson's gaze. When the bell finally rang, students practically fled the room, several shooting sympathetic glances at Alex as they left. Alex was the last to pack up his things. As he headed for the door, Ms. Peterson called out, Remember, Mr. Chen, tomorrow morning first thing, and do try to make it worth my time to read. In the hallway, a few of his classmates waited for him. Reg stepped forward first. That wasn't right. What happened in there? Some of us could help you with the paper. Thanks, Alex cut him off quietly, but I need to do this myself. He adjusted his backpack on his shoulder, straightened his spine, and headed down the hallway. What nobody in that classroom knew, not his well-meaning classmates, and certainly not Miss Peterson, was that Alex had actually spent the entire weekend preparing for this presentation. He'd worked on it during his breaks at work, staying up late into the night to perfect every point. The folder he carried contained not just his presentation notes, but also backup research, alternative examples, and even extra visual aids he hadn't gotten the chance to show. As he walked to his next class, his mind was already racing, trying to figure out how he could possibly complete a 10-page paper between his afternoon shift at work and his evening responsibilities at home. But despite the weight of the unfair punishment settling on his shoulders, something in his expression suggested that this wouldn't be the last Miss Peterson would hear from the quiet transfer student from Pine Ridge. The sun had already set by the time Alex left the Silver Spoon Diner, his work uniform stuffed into his backpack. The evening air was crisp, and his breath formed small clouds as he hurried down the quiet streets. His shoulders ached from hours of carrying heavy trays, but he couldn't rest yet. The 10-page paper for Miss Peterson still loomed ahead of him. Inside his pocket, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his mom, at hospital for night shift. Left soup in fridge. Don't stay up too late studying. Love you. Alex smiled despite his exhaustion. His mom always thought of him first, even now. He picked up his pace, wanting to check on her before she started her shift. The hospital was only a few blocks away, and he knew exactly which entrance to use. He'd been walking this route every evening for the past 3 months. The fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby cast harsh shadows as Alex made his way to the staff locker room. He found his mom putting on her nurse's uniform, her movements slower than they used to be. Even with her bright smile, he could see the fatigue in her eyes. "You didn't have to come," she said, pulling him into a quick hug. "You should be home working on that paper you mentioned." "Just wanted to make sure you're okay," Alex replied, noticing how her uniform hung a little looser than before. The chemotherapy was taking its toll, but she refused to take time off. They couldn't afford it, not with the medical bills piling up. "I'm fine," she assured him, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Mrs. Kumar from physical therapy brings me tea during breaks, and Dr. Patel checks on me between rounds." She straightened his collar, a habit from when he was younger. "Now go home and finish that paper. You're doing so well in your new school. I'm proud of you." Alex felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't told her about Ms. Peterson's treatment or today's humiliation. His mom had enough to worry about without adding his school troubles to the list. "Love you, Mom," he said, giving her another quick hug before heading out. "Text me if you need anything." The walk home felt longer than usual. His mind wandered back to this morning's presentation disaster, then to the paper due tomorrow. He had less than 12 hours to write 10 pages with 8 scholarly sources. The public library was already closed, and their home internet was too slow for proper research. Their apartment was dark when he arrived. It was small, just 1 bedroom, which he insisted his mom take while he slept on the pull-out couch in the living room. But it was home. Alex heated up the soup his mom had left and spread his schoolwork across their small kitchen table. Opening his laptop, an old model he bought refurbished with his first paycheck from the diner, he began to work. The scholarly sources would be the biggest challenge. The school library had been closed by the time classes ended, and he'd had to rush straight to work afterward. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Raj. "Hey, sending you some research papers on Gatsby. My dad's a professor, has access to academic databases. No plagiarism, just sources to cite. We've got your back." Minutes later, several PDFs arrived in his email. Alex felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't expected anyone to help, especially not after what happened in class. He'd gotten used to handling everything alone since his mom's diagnosis. As the night wore on, Alex wrote through his exhaustion. He analyzed every theme Ms. Peterson had demanded, cross-referenced every source, and triple-checked his citations. The words sometimes blurred before his eyes, but he kept going. His mom had taught him that giving up wasn't an option, no matter how unfair things seemed. Around 3 a.m., his phone lit up with another text from his mom. "Just checked on Mr. Rodriguez in room 412. Remember when you used to read to him during your volunteer shifts? He asked about you today." Alex smiled, remembering the elderly patient who'd helped him practice his English pronunciation last summer. That's what Ms. Peterson didn't know, that his after-school activities weren't just about making money. Even with 2 jobs, he still volunteered at the hospital when he could, reading to patients or helping in the children's ward. The sky was beginning to lighten when Alex finally finished the paper. His eyes burned, and his back ached from hunching over the laptop, but he'd done it. 10 pages of careful analysis, properly cited sources, and even a counter-argument section that he hoped would impress Ms. Peterson. As he printed the paper using the ancient printer they'd gotten from a thrift store, Alex thought about his classmates. They'd probably assumed he was angry about what happened, about being singled out and humiliated. But the truth was, he was too tired for anger. Between his mom's illness, his jobs, and now this paper, he barely had energy for anything else. Getting ready for school, Alex caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but something else was there too. A quiet determination. He thought about Mr. Rodriguez and the other patients he helped, about his mom working through their chemotherapy, about Rage and his unexpected kindness. Ms. Peterson thought she knew his story, the transfer student from the wrong side of town who couldn't possibly belong in her AP class. But she had no idea about the life he lived outside those classroom walls. She didn't know about the hours he spent helping others even when he barely had time to help himself. She couldn't see the strength it took to keep going when everything seemed stacked against you. As Alex carefully placed the finished paper in his folder, his mom's words from long ago echoed in his mind. It's not about proving others wrong, it's about proving yourself right. He might be exhausted, but he was ready to face another day. Ready to prove, one assignment at a time, that he belonged exactly where he was. The morning sun was rising as Alex left for school, his completed paper secure in his backpack. In a few hours, Ms. Peterson would read it, probably looking for any excuse to criticize his work. But for now, Alex let himself feel a small sense of victory. He'd done what she thought was impossible, and he'd done it while balancing all the responsibilities she knew nothing about. What Ms. Peterson would soon learn was that sometimes the quietest students carried the heaviest burdens and the strongest spirits. The next morning arrived with a bitter chill that matched the atmosphere in room 203. Alex walked into class 5 minutes early, as usual, clutching his completed paper. Despite his exhaustion, he'd made sure every page was pristine, every citation perfect. His classmates watched silently as he placed the assignment on Ms. Peterson's desk. She didn't even look up from her morning coffee. "We'll see if this meets our standards, Mr. Chen." The first half of class passed in tense silence as Ms. Peterson read through student essays from the previous week. Alex tried to focus on the class discussion about symbolism, but his eyes kept drifting to his paper, still untouched at the corner of her desk. Every time she reached for it, she seemed to deliberately choose another assignment instead. Finally, with 15 minutes left in class, she picked up his paper. The room grew quiet as she flipped through the pages, her red pen poised like a weapon. But instead of marking the paper, she simply set it down and looked directly at Alex. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying that dangerous calm her students have learned to fear, "would you care to explain this?" I don't understand," Alex replied, fighting to keep his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Is there something wrong with the paper?" "Wrong?" Miss Peterson stood up, lifting the paper as if it were evidence in a trial. "Do you really expect me to believe you wrote this overnight? 10 pages of allegedly original analysis with perfectly formatted citations and scholarly sources." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Alex felt his face grow hot as his classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I did write it," he said quietly but firmly. "I stayed up all night." "Exactly." Ms. Peterson cut him off. "All night to copy and paste from various sources, perhaps? To cobble together something you thought would fool me?" She walked to the front of the room, paper still in hand. "In all my years of teaching, I've never seen a student from your background produce this level of work overnight." The room went deadly silent. Even the usual hallway noise seemed to fade away. Several students exchanged shocked looks at her thinly veiled prejudice. "What do you mean, my background?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's be honest, shall we?" Miss Peterson continued, apparently oblivious to the tension in the room. "You come from Pine Ridge, a school not exactly known for its academic rigor. You clearly spend your time working rather than studying. And now you expect me to believe you produced a college-level analysis in one night?" Alex's hands gripped the edges of his desk. The lack of sleep, combined with the unfairness of it all, made his voice shake as he responded, "I worked hard on that paper. Every word is mine. You can check any plagiarism software." "Oh, I intend to," she interrupted. "But first, I think a trip to the principal's office is in order. Academic dishonesty is a serious offense, Mr. Chen." That was when Rage stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Miss Peterson, I gave him those scholarly sources. My father's a professor at the university, and I sent Alex some papers from academic databases. That's not cheating, that's research." "Sit down, Mr. Puttle," Ms. Peterson snapped. "This doesn't concern you." But something had shifted in the room. Another student raised her hand. "I saw Alex working on the paper in the diner last night. He was there for hours between serving customers." "Nobody asked for your input," Ms. Peterson said sharply, but more hands were going up. "He helps my little sister with her reading at the hospital," another student added. He volunteers there after his shift ends. That's enough. Ms. Peterson's voice rose. This isn't a democracy. Mr. Chen, take your things and report to the principal's office immediately. Alex slowly stood up, his legs shaky from exhaustion, but as he reached for his backpack, his phone buzzed. The screen showed a text from his mom. Just finished chemo. Feeling okay. Hope your paper turned out well. Proud of you always. Something inside Alex snapped, not in anger, but in revelation. He looked up at Ms. Peterson, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't feel intimidated. No, he said quietly. Excuse me. Ms. Peterson's eyes widened behind her glasses. The walk to the principal's office felt like the longest journey of Alex's life. The hallways were empty, with only the distant sound of teachers' voices drifting from behind closed doors. His heart was pounding, but for the first time in weeks, he felt oddly at peace. Sometimes, he thought, standing up for yourself was its own victory. Principal Kumar was on the phone when Alex arrived. She held up one finger, signaling him to wait, but her expression changed when she saw his exhausted face. Quickly ending her call, she gestured for him to sit down. Alex, she said warmly, what brings you to my office this morning? Before he could answer, rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway. Miss Peterson burst in, still clutching Alex's paper, a usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. Behind her came Rage and 2 other students from class, all talking at once. Mrs. Kumar, I need to report a case of academic dishonesty. Miss Peterson's been targeting Alex unfairly. We all saw how hard he worked. One at a time, Principal Kumar said firmly, raising her hands for silence. She turned to Ms. Peterson first. What seems to be the issue? Ms. Peterson thrust Alex's paper forward. This student submitted a supposedly original paper that's clearly beyond his capabilities. Given his background and circumstances, there's no way. My circumstances? Alex interrupted quietly. Even Principal Kumar seemed surprised by his unusual boldness. You mean like how I scored perfect marks on the state academic excellence exam? Or how I was offered scholarships to 3 private schools, but chose to come here instead? Ms. Peterson's mouth opened and closed without sound. Principal Kumar leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Alex, why don't you tell us your side of the story? So he did. He told them about the unfair punishment, about staying up all night writing while worrying about his mom, about the constant assumptions and subtle digs about his background. His classmates chimed in, describing how Miss Peterson had singled him out from day one. As they spoke, a new figure appeared in the doorway, a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. Nobody noticed him at first, as Miss Peterson was in the middle of defending her actions. While these accusations are concerning, she was saying, the fact remains that a student of his situation simply couldn't produce this level of work overnight. Perhaps at his previous school, Pine Ridge High School, the man in the doorway interrupted, consistently ranks in the top 10% for academic achievement in underprivileged areas. I should know. I helped design their advanced curriculum program 6 years ago. Everyone turned toward the voice. Principal Kumar stood up immediately, her eyes wide with recognition. Dr. Chen, we weren't expecting you until next week. The room fell silent as understanding slowly dawned. Ms. Peterson's face went pale as she looked between Alex and the man in the doorway. I apologize for arriving early, Dr. Chen said, stepping into the office. But when your son texts you at 3 in the morning asking for help with NLA citations, you tend to worry. He placed a gentle hand on Alex's shoulder. Though it seems I had more reason to be concerned than I thought. Principal Kumar cleared her throat. Miss Peterson, allow me to introduce Dr. James Chen, our incoming district superintendent, and, apparently, Alex's father. The silence in the room was deafening. Miss Peterson stared at Alex as if seeing him for the first time. But he works at a diner. And his clothes. My son, Dr. Chen said quietly, works at the diner because he believes in earning his own way. He wears those clothes because he spends his money helping his mother with medical bills and donating to the hospital's children's ward. He transferred here because he wanted to be closer to the hospital where his mother receives treatment and because he believed in this school's potential. Alex looked up at his father, surprised. They hadn't discussed his reasons for choosing Westbrook High. When Alex told me about this school, Dr. Chen continued. He said it had dedicated teachers who could help shape its future. That's part of why I accepted the superintendent position, his faith in this place. He picked up Alex's paper from Ms. Peterson's limp hands. Though it seems some of that faith may have been misplaced. Principal Kumar's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled slightly. And speaking of faith, Dr. Chen, the board members have arrived early as well. They're waiting in the conference room for our meeting about improving district-wide teaching standards. Perfect timing, Dr. Chen said. I believe we have a rather concrete example to discuss. He turned to Ms. Peterson, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. Would you care to join us? I think your input on classroom discrimination and academic prejudice could be illuminating. But before Ms. Peterson could respond, Alex spoke up. Dad, wait. Everyone turned to look at him. Despite his exhaustion, his voice was clear and steady. This isn't about punishment, it's about learning and growing. Isn't that what education is supposed to be about? Dr. Chen studied his son's face for a long moment, then smiled proudly. Even after everything, you're still teaching us, aren't you? He turned back to Ms. Peterson, whose expression had shifted from fear to something like shame. My son makes an excellent point. Perhaps instead of punishment, this could be an opportunity for positive change. Principal Kumar nodded thoughtfully. I believe we're overdue for a comprehensive review of our teaching methods and bias training programs. She looked at the students still hovering near the door. And maybe it's time we started listening more to our students' experiences. As the adults began discussing plans for teacher workshops and student feedback sessions, Alex finally let himself relax. He hadn't wanted his father's position to become public knowledge. He'd always preferred to make his own way. But sometimes, he realized, the truth had a way of coming out exactly when it needed to. Reg caught his eye from the doorway and gave him a thumbs up. Whatever happened next, Alex knew he wasn't alone anymore. Sometimes the hardest lessons weren't found in any textbook, and the best teachers weren't always the ones at the front of the classroom. News travels fast in high school, and by lunchtime, the whole story had spread through Westbrook's hallways like wildfire. Students gathered in small groups, discussing how the quiet transfer student turned out to be the incoming superintendent's son. But what really got people talking wasn't Alex's family connection, it was how he'd stood up to Ms. Peterson while staying true to his principles. Ms. Peterson wasn't in class for the rest of the week. Rumors said she was attending emergency meetings with the school board and going through intensive sensitivity training. Her absence left room 203 feeling strangely empty, but also lighter somehow, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. On Monday morning, students filed into first period English to find a substitute teacher, Mrs. Lee, waiting at the front of the classroom. She had warm eyes and a gentle smile that immediately put everyone at ease. Good morning, everyone, she said, arranging some papers on the desk. I'll be with you for the next few weeks while some changes are being implemented. But first, I think we need to have an honest conversation about what happened last week. The class shifted nervously, but Mrs. Lee just pulled up a chair and sat down, making herself level with the students. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about learning and growing together. Would anyone like to share their thoughts? At first, no one moved. Then Rage raised his hand. It wasn't just about what happened with Alex, he said quietly. Some of us, we saw things that made us uncomfortable before, but we never spoke up. We were too afraid. Others began nodding. One by one, stories started coming out. A girl named Amy talked about how Miss Peterson had mocked her accent when she first moved from another state. Tom mentioned how she'd made assumptions about his intelligence because he was an athlete. Each story was different, but they all shared the same theme: prejudice hidden behind the mask of high standards. Alex sat quietly, taking it all in. He hadn't wanted to become the center of attention, but somehow his situation had opened a door for others to speak their truth too. During lunch break, Principal Kumar called an unexpected assembly. The entire student body gathered in the auditorium, buzzing with speculation. To everyone's surprise, Ms. Peterson was there too, standing off to the side, looking different somehow, smaller, more human. Principal Kumar stepped up to the microphone. Last week, an incident in our school forced us to look at some uncomfortable truths, she began. We pride ourselves on academic excellence, but somewhere along the way, We forgot that true education isn't just about test scores and perfect papers. It's about growing as people, learning to see beyond our prejudices, and treating each other with dignity and respect. She gestured to Ms. Peterson, who slowly walked to the podium. The auditorium went silent. Ms. Peterson's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "I've been teaching for 23 years, she began, her voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. I always thought I was pushing my students toward excellence. But last week showed me that I wasn't just pushing. I was pushing some students down while pulling others up based on nothing but my own biases." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I've spent the past few days in intensive training and self-reflection. It's been enlightening and humbling, very humbling." She looked directly at where Alex sat with his classmates. "I owe many of you an apology, especially you, Alex. I judged you based on superficial things, where you came from, what you wore, how you spoke. I never bothered to see the remarkable person behind those surface details." The silence in the auditorium was profound. Nobody had ever heard Ms. Peterson admit to being wrong about anything. "I'd asked Principal Kumar for a chance to do better," she continued, "to learn and grow alongside my students. But I'll understand if some of you find it difficult to trust me again. Trust, like respect, has to be earned." After the assembly, more changes began rolling through Westbrook High. A student advocacy program was established, giving kids a real voice in school policies. Teachers started attending regular workshops on inclusive teaching methods and recognizing unconscious bias. The administration began reviewing its policies on everything from dress codes to disciplinary actions. But perhaps the most surprising change happened in room 203. Ms. Peterson returned to teaching after 3 weeks, but she was noticeably different. She still maintained high standards, but now she worked to help students reach them instead of just demanding perfection. She started keeping her door open during lunch breaks, offering help to anyone who needed it. One afternoon, she asked Alex to stay after class. He approached her desk, remembering the last time they'd been in this situation. But this time, her expression was different, open, almost uncertain. "I've been reading your paper again," she said, pulling out the assignment that had sparked everything. "Not looking for flaws this time, but really reading it. Your analysis of Gatsby's transformation, it's not just about the character, is it? It's about how people can change, how they can become better versions of themselves if given the chance." Alex nodded slowly. "Everyone deserves that chance," he said, "to be seen for who they really are, not who others assume them to be." Ms. Peterson smiled slightly, her first genuine smile that any student could remember seeing. "Would you be willing to share your paper with the class? I think we could all learn something from it." As Alex walked home that afternoon, he thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. The truth about his father's position had come out, yes, but that wasn't what really mattered. What mattered was how one moment of standing up for what was right had created ripples of change throughout the entire school. His phone buzzed with a message from his mom. "Got your test results back. Looking much better. Proud of you, not just for your grades, but for who you are." Alex smiled, thinking about all the lessons learned in room 203, lessons that went far beyond English literature. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest acts of courage, and sometimes the best teachers were the ones who weren't afraid to learn alongside their students. 6 months had passed since the day Alex walked out of Ms. Peterson's classroom. Spring had arrived at Westbrook High, bringing with it not just blooming flowers in the courtyard, but blooming changes throughout the school. The morning sun streamed through the windows of room 203, where something remarkable was taking place. "Excellent analysis, Andy," Ms. Peterson said warmly to a chief freshman who had just finished presenting his paper. "I especially liked how you connected the theme to your own experiences. Would anyone else like to share their thoughts?" Several hands shot up, a sight that would have been unthinkable half a year ago. The classroom, once ruled by fear, had transformed into a place where students felt safe to share their ideas, even if they weren't perfect. Alex watched from his usual seat by the window, thinking about how much had changed. The student advocacy program he'd helped establish was flourishing. Every Tuesday and Thursday at lunch, students gathered to discuss their concerns with teachers and administrators. More importantly, they were actually being heard. After class, Ms. Peterson called Alex over to her desk. On it sat a letter from the State Education Board. "They want me to speak at their annual conference," she said, shaking her head in disbelief, "about transforming classroom culture and fighting unconscious bias." Can you imagine? "Actually, I can," Alex replied with a smile. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the intimidating figure who had once made students tremble. Her hair was still neat, but not severely pulled back anymore. Her voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by genuine warmth. "I was hoping," she said, "you might help me prepare the presentation. Your perspective would be invaluable." Before Alex could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. A small group of students stood there, looking nervous but determined. "Miss Peterson?" one of them asked. "Could we get some help with our college application essays? We heard you doing lunch tutoring sessions." "Of course," she beamed, gesturing them in. "Alex, would you mind staying? Your insight could really help them too." As the students settled in, Alex noticed something that made him smile. They were from all different backgrounds, wearing everything from designer clothes to hand-me-downs, speaking with various accents and mannerisms. 6 months ago, some of them wouldn't have dared to ask for help, afraid of being judged. Now they sat together, sharing snacks and stories as they worked on their essays. Later that afternoon, Alex headed to the hospital for his volunteer shift. He didn't need to work at the diner anymore. His mom's treatments were showing great results, and his dad's position helped with the medical bills. But he kept volunteering because it mattered to him. In the children's ward, he found a surprise waiting. Miss Peterson was there, reading to a group of young patients. She had started volunteering too, saying she wanted to understand her students' lives better. Every week, she brought books and spent hours with kids who needed a friendly voice. "Hey, look who's here." One of the young patients called out when they saw Alex. "Can you do the funny voices again for the story?" Alex grinned and pulled up a chair. As he and Miss Peterson took turns reading, adding dramatic voices and gestures that made the kids giggle, he caught sight of his mom watching from the doorway. She looked healthier now, her smile bright as she watched her son doing what he loved. That evening, during a family dinner, something they could all enjoy together now that his mom was feeling better, Alex's father brought up an interesting piece of news. "The school board is implementing our new program district-wide," Dr. Chen announced. "Every school will now have a student advocacy program and mandatory sensitivity training for teachers, and guess who they want to help coordinate it?" Alex looked up from his plate. "Miss Peterson." "And you," his father replied. "They want student input every step of the way. Real input, not just for show." Alex thought about it. He was no longer the quiet transfer student trying to stay invisible. He had found his voice, and more importantly, he had helped others find theirs too. The next morning, as Alex walked into Westbrook High, he passed the newly installed suggestion box, now emptied and acted upon regularly. He saw younger students chatting comfortably with teachers in the hallway. In the library, a study group included kids from all different social circles, helping each other with assignments. In room 203, Miss Peterson was already there, but she wasn't alone. She was helping a student who had been struggling with English because it wasn't her first language. The scene was so different from that tense morning 6 months ago that it almost felt like a different world. "You know," Miss Peterson said during their morning discussion, "we often talk about the American dream in literature. But I've learned it's not just about success or wealth. It's about transformation, the ability to change, to grow, to become better than we were yesterday." She looked around the classroom, meeting each student's eyes. "You've all taught me that, especially you, Alex. Sometimes the best lessons come from the students we least expect to be our teachers." As Alex listened to his classmates share their thoughts freely without fear of judgment, he realized that true change wasn't just about big moments or dramatic revelations. It was about the small things. A kind word, a moment of understanding, the courage to speak up, the wisdom to listen. The bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Westbrook High. But now, instead of dread, there was anticipation in the air. Because everyone in room 203 knew that they weren't just learning about literature or grammar, they were learning about life, about each other, and about the incredible power of giving everyone a chance to be heard.